MV Doña Paz. The MV Doña Paz was a passenger ferry from the Philippines, but it was originally built in Japan back in 1963 and was first named Hime Yorimaru. It was about 305 feet long and 45 feet wide, made to carry around 600 people. In 1975, a company called Sulpicio Lines bought the ship. After a fire in 1979, they fixed it up, renamed it Doña Paz, and it started running between islands in the Philippines. It became a familiar sight, sleek and always packed with passengers. On December 20th, 1987, the Doña Paz left Tacloban City, heading to Manila. It was the holiday season. So many passengers were excited to get home for Christmas. The official list said there were 1,583 passengers and 58 crew members on board. But in reality, it was believed that more than 4,000 people were on the ship, including many who weren't listed and around 100 soldiers. That night, while crossing the Tablas Strait, the ferry crashed into an oil tanker called the MT Vector. The tanker was carrying about 8,800 barrels of gasoline and other fuels. The collision caused a huge explosion, and both ships caught fire almost immediately. Survivors described how the flames spread so fast, and everything turned to chaos. People had to jump into the burning water, grabbing anything they could to stay afloat. Within 2 hours, the Doña Paz sank. The Vector sank soon after. Sadly, only 26 people survived, 24 from the ferry and 2 from the tanker. It's believed that around 4,386 lives were lost, making it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Later investigations showed that safety was badly handled on both ships. The Doña Paz didn't have a working radio, and life jackets were locked up and couldn't be reached during the emergency. As for the MT Vector, it didn't even have a valid license. Its crew wasn't properly trained, and its steering system was faulty. It was a disaster just waiting to happen. MV Leola. The MV Leola was a ferry owned by the Senegalese government. It was built in Germany in 1990 and was about 260 feet long and 39 feet wide. The ferry could safely carry up to 580 people, including the crew. It played a big role in helping people travel between the Casamance region and Senegal's capital Dakar, especially when road travel wasn't safe because of conflicts in the area. On September 26, 2002, it left the town of Ziguinchor, heading for Dakar. Even though it wasn't meant to carry more than 580 people, the ferry had nearly 2,000 passengers on board. Some of them had even boarded from a small island called Carabane, where there was no proper port. That evening, while sailing near the coast of the Gambia, the ferry ran into a strong storm. Because it was so overcrowded and many people were on the upper decks, the ship became unstable and flipped over in just 5 minutes. Only 64 people made it out alive. About 1,863 people died. Rescue teams didn't arrive right away. In fact, local fishermen were the first to get there hours later. Some survivors said they could hear people crying for help from inside the upside-down ferry, but rescuers didn't have the equipment to reach them. Investigations later showed that a lot of things had gone wrong. The ferry was sailing too far from the coast, which it wasn't allowed to do. Only one of its 2 engines was working, and passengers couldn't access life jackets when the accident happened. The crew hadn't even checked the weather before leaving. Worst of all, the ferry didn't have a valid license to sail. It had expired back in 1998. The government blamed the captain who died in the accident and fired several high-ranking officials, including the Prime Minister. Because 18 French citizens had also died, France started its own investigation and charged 7 Senegalese officials. But in the end, the case was dropped due to legal issues between the countries. MV Estonia. The MV Estonia was a large white and blue ferry built in 1980. It was designed to carry both people and vehicles across the Baltic Sea and was run by a company called Eastline. The ferry was about 515 feet long and 78 feet wide. It had several decks with cabins, lounges, and other facilities, and was an important way for people to travel between Tallinn, Estonia, and Stockholm, Sweden. On September 27, 1994, the Estonia left Tallinn for a regular trip to Stockholm. There were 889 people on board, including both passengers and crew. Many were just returning home or traveling for work. But in the early hours of the next morning, disaster struck. The ferry sailed into a strong storm with rough waves. Investigators later found that the locks on the ship's bow visor, the large front door used for loading cars, weren't strong enough for such harsh weather. The visor broke off and the ramp underneath it opened, letting water pour onto the car deck. This quickly made the ship unstable. It tilted to one side and sank within minutes. Sadly, 852 people lost their lives that night. Only 137 survived, rescued by nearby ships and helicopters. An official investigation later confirmed that the bow visor wasn't built to handle such force, and the crew didn't react in time. Also, no automatic distress signal was sent out, which made rescue efforts slower. MV Princess of the Stars. The MV Princess of the Stars was a passenger ferry from the Philippines owned by Suplicio Lines. It was originally built in Japan in 1984 and was first called the Ferry Lilac. The ship was pretty big, about 633 feet long and 95 feet wide, and could carry both people and vehicles. Suplicio Lines bought it in 2004 and made it their main ferry for trips between Manila and Cebu. On June 20th, 2008, the Princess of the Stars left Manila heading for Cebu City. There were 870 people on board, including passengers and crew. A typhoon named Feng Shen, called Typhoon Frank in the Philippines, had already hit land earlier that day, but the ship was still allowed to sail. Authorities believed the ferry was big enough to handle the outer winds of the storm, but the typhoon suddenly changed direction and ended up heading straight toward the ship. By the next day, June 21st, the ferry was struggling in rough seas near San Fernando Romblon. The storm got worse. The ship started tilting, and eventually it capsized. Out of everyone on board, only 56 survived. Sadly, 814 lives were lost. The storm was so strong that rescue teams couldn't reach the area right away, which delayed help for the survivors. When investigators looked into what happened, they found that the captain had misjudged the storm's path and didn't take the proper precautions. Both the captain and Suplicio Lines were found to be at fault for poor decision-making and lack of safety measures. To make things worse, the ferry was also carrying a large amount of dangerous pesticides called endosulfan, about 22,000 pounds of it, which no one had reported before the trip. Because of this, recovery efforts had to be paused until the toxic cargo could be safely removed. Years later, in 2024, the Court of Appeals confirmed that Suplicio Lines was responsible for gross negligence and ordered the company to pay compensation to the families of the victims. MV Rabaul Queen. The MV Rabaul Queen was a white passenger ferry built in Japan back in 1983 and later brought to Papua New Guinea in 1998. It was about 154 feet long and 38 feet wide, and it was officially allowed to carry 310 passengers and 12 crew members. But in reality, it often carried more than that. The ferry regularly traveled between the island city of Kimbe and the mainland city of Lai. On February 2, 2012, the Rabaul Queen left Kimbe for Lai on what was supposed to be a normal trip. People on board included students, teachers, merchants, and families. Official records said there were about 350 people on board, but later investigations estimated the number to be between 392 and 411, including babies without tickets. As the ferry entered the Vitia Strait, a rough area known for bad weather during monsoon season, it ran into strong winds over 39 miles per hour and waves around 13 feet high. These conditions had actually been predicted by official weather service, but the owners ignored it and chose to believe their own more favorable forecast. Heavy rain and sea spray hit passengers on the right side of the ship. So many moved to the left side to get away from it. This sudden shift made the ferry unstable. Then, a series of big waves slammed into the side of the ship. It rolled over, capsized, and sank in waters nearly 3,300 feet deep. Out of everyone on board, 246 people were rescued, but sadly, between 146 and 165 people died, many of them trapped inside the ferry. A commission of inquiry led by Judge Warwick Andrew looked into what went wrong and found several serious problems. The ferry was overloaded. The crew wasn't fully trained or certified, and passengers never had emergency drills. Life jackets were hard to access. The ship wasn't properly maintained, and the owners used an unofficial weather report instead of listening to the national forecast. The report made it clear this wasn't just bad luck. It was a disaster caused by human negligence. MV Sewol. The MV Sewol was a South Korean passenger and cargo ferry originally built in Japan in 1994. It was about 469 feet long and 72 feet wide, designed to carry both people and goods. After being bought by the Chongaijin Marine Company, the ferry was modified to fit more passengers by adding extra cabins. But those changes made the ship top-heavy and less stable in the water. On April 16, 2014, the Sewal left Incheon, heading to Jeju Island. On board were 476 people, including 325 high school students from Danwon High School who were going on a school trip. While passing through the Mengol Channel, the ferry made a sharp turn. Because the cargo wasn't tied down properly, it shifted all at once, causing the ship to tilt badly. The crew told passengers to stay in their rooms instead of starting an immediate evacuation. As a result, many were trapped when the ferry tipped over and sank. 304 people died, most of them students. Later investigations revealed that Sewal was carrying more cargo than it was allowed to, and it didn't have enough ballast water to help balance the ship. The crew also didn't follow safety procedures and lacked the training to handle an emergency. The captain, Lee Jun-suk, and several crew members were found guilty of gross negligence and were sent to prison. MV Neri. The MV Neri was a passenger ferry in Tanzania that operated on Lake Victoria. It mainly carried people between Bugolora and Ukerewe Island and Buisia and Ukara Island. The ferry had been in service since its construction in 2004. It was meant to carry 100 passengers, 25 tons of cargo, and 3 vehicles. Run by Temasa, the ferry was an important part of life for island residents, especially on market days when more people needed to travel. On September 20th, 2018, the ferry left Ukerewe for its usual trip to Ukara Island, but this time it was dangerously overloaded. Reports say there were over 300 people on board, along with goods like maize, bananas, cement, and even a tractor. Just as the ferry got close to the Ukara dock, only about 160 feet from shore, it suddenly made a sharp turn. With so many passengers rushing to get off and the ferry already unstable, it couldn't handle the shift. The boat flipped over and sank. The accident was heartbreaking. 228 people lost their lives and only 41 survived. One of the survivors, an engineer named Augustine Charani, was miraculously found alive more than 40 hours later, trapped in an air pocket in the engine room. Investigations showed several serious problems. The ferry was heavily overloaded, and the person steering it wasn't properly trained. The actual captain wasn't even on board. On top of that, the ticket records were missing, so no one knew exactly how many people were on the ferry. In response to the tragedy, President John Magufuli ordered the arrest of those responsible. A special team led by General George Waitara was put in charge of finding out what went wrong. The sunken ferry was later pulled ashore for inspection. The government declared 4 days of national mourning and promised to take stronger steps to make ferry travel on Lake Victoria safer for everyone. MV Bakoba. The MV Bakoba was a passenger and cargo ferry in Tanzania that sailed on Lake Victoria, running between the ports of Bakoba and Mwanza. It was built in 1979 in Belgium and measured about 195 feet long and 31 feet wide. The ferry could carry up to 430 passengers and 850 tons of cargo. Operated by the Tanzania Railways Corporation, it was an important way for people and goods to travel across the lake. On May 21, 1996, tragedy struck. The MV Bakoba sank about 35 miles from Mwanza. The official manifest listed 443 passengers in the first and second class, but there were no records for third-class passengers. It's estimated that over 800 people were actually on board, including many students heading home after exams. One of the victims was Abu Abaida al-Banshiri, a senior member of Al-Qaeda. The ferry was overloaded, and during the journey, it started leaning to one side. Eventually, it capsized and sank in water about 82 feet deep. Many passengers were trapped inside as the ship went down. Rescue efforts were slow and difficult. Tanzania didn't have enough equipment or trained divers, so help had to come from South Africa. In the end, only 114 people survived, and the official death toll reached 894. Investigators found a number of serious problems. The ferry was overloaded. It didn't have enough life-saving equipment, and maintenance was poor. The crew and officials from the Tanzania Railways Corporation were blamed for negligence. 9 people, including the captain and a TRC Marine manager, were charged in court. MV Alsam Bakio 98. The MV Alsam Bakio 98 was a passenger ferry from Egypt run by Al Salam Maritime Transport. It was originally built in Italy in 1970 and was about 430 feet long and 77 feet wide. In 1991, it was upgraded to carry up to 1,300 passengers and 320 vehicles with a total weight of 11,799 gross tons. The ferry was commonly used for trips across the Red Sea, especially between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. On February 2, 2006, the ferry left Duba, Saudi Arabia, heading towards Safaga, Egypt. On board were around 1,400 people, including Egyptian workers returning home and pilgrims who had just completed Hajj in Mecca, along with about 220 vehicles. Not long after leaving port, a fire broke out, possibly in the engine room or a lower storage area. While the crew tried to put out the flames, water from firefighting efforts collected on the car deck because the drainage pumps weren't working properly. That trapped water made the ship unstable, and due to the ship's design, it couldn't handle this kind of situation well. Even though the captain asked to turn back, the owners told him to keep going. The ferry began tilting more and more until it eventually capsized, sinking about 57 miles from its destination. Only 387 people survived. More than 1,000 lives were lost, making it one of the worst ferry disasters in recent history. After investigations, several problems came to light. It wasn't clear what exactly started the fire. It could have been a vehicle's fuel tank or even a passenger's luggage. But what really made things worse was the ferry's unstable design and the owner's decision to ignore the captain's warning. In 2009, the ferry's owner, Mamdou Ismail, was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and 2 other company employees were given 3-year sentences. Later in 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled that families of the victims could also sue the Italian company Rena, which had approved the ship as seaworthy.